direction. The guy working that night, bless his heart, he worked the day before. There was a fire the previous day in about that spot. When he looked in the distance and saw the smoke start to rise, he went, nah, just smoldering from yesterday, and he ignored it. Looked back again, realized his mistake, rang the alarm, accidentally sent the firefighters in the wrong direction. By the time they got back over here, it was too late. Fire was burning out of control, and a wind kicked up just right to carry the fire across the river. It literally jumped the river, not once, but twice. That's how the fire was able to spread so far and cause $222 million worth of damage. That's 1871 money. So this was a huge disaster. At the same time, though, we now had a completely clean slate. Architects and engineers came from all over the world to help us rebuild. And by then, mankind had figured out how to manipulate steel. So now we could make steel-framed buildings that were much lighter than their predecessors, masonry-framed buildings. That meant we could now build higher and higher into the sky. Chicago is called the birthplace of the skyscraper because William LeBaron Jenney, he built the home insurance building here in 1885. First steel frame building above 10 stories, and we kept getting bigger and better from there. So without the Great Chicago Fire, we would not have the city that we do today, nor would we have the absolutely amazing skyline that we do today. As you turn around here, you get a great view of a very special part of that skyline. You got the Sears Tower in the background there, tallest building in Chicago. I refuse to call it the Willis Tower, so let's not start with that. In front of the Sears Tower right now, there's a pinkish building that has a giant glass crown at the top. That building is known by its address, 311 South Wacker. If you could just remember the glass crown, I'll tell you a story about it in a few minutes. So go ahead, guys, get some pictures. Visit Beth at the bar if you're thirsty. I'll get back to you once we get turned around. That part of the roof. That weight is redistributed by trusses into the bases of the two towers that flank it. Those are 40-story towers. They're a little bit concerned hanging the weight of the middle off of them would cause the towers to collapse onto each other. So they constructed the towers at a slightly bowed outward angle, and when the weight of the middle was put in, the towers corrected themselves back to 90 degrees. So Fujikawa Johnson and Associates won a lot of structural engineering awards for the Merc. And that is going to bring us next to the Civic Opera House. If you look way up at it, it looks like a giant armchair or throne. We call that Inzel's throne because industrialist Samuel Inzel commissioned this building's construction in 1928 from Graham Anderson Probst and White. Here comes the folklore. The story goes that Inzel had a girlfriend and she wanted to be an opera singer. She was bad, couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. So when she went to New York and tried out for the Metropolitan Opera, they said, honey. She came back here and she was so upset. He built her an opera house so she would have some place to sing. They say it's shaped like a giant chair because Inzel was so insulted, he wanted his spirit to forever sit in his chair and turn his back on New York for being mean to her. But here's the kicker. Inzel and everybody who invested money into that opera house all went bankrupt because of the stock market crash in 1929. That just goes to show you, if you're going to build an opera house for someone, probably should be for your wife, not for the woman you're cheating on her with, because karma will come back and get you in the end. That's the end of that story. Moral lessons on a boat, who'd have thought? This little guy on the right, with the corrugated steel ribbons across the front. I know to most people it's not the most beautiful building that ever was, but this is a last example of its kind of architecture that exists yet on the Chicago River. The style is known as the International style. Basically, it's a combination of modernism and prairie. Modernism we've seen plenty of today, big glass and steel boxes. Prairie style is when buildings are lowered to the ground, typically 5 stories or less, and spread out horizontally to remind you of and blend in with the rolling prairies that we have in Illinois. Coming up next on the right is a red brick building that has ivy-covered walls. That is called the Great Lakes Building, and it is architecturally insignificant. Made you look? No. I do love a good made you look joke, but it sits on a very historic site. It was here in 1860. The Republicans had their national convention and a temporary structure called the Wigwam. That is where Abraham Lincoln was nominated to become the 16th President of the United States. Rising above the Great Lakes Building, there's a shiny blue building. That one's known by its address, 191 North Wacker Drive. We're going to see it again after this bridge. So after the bridge, we're going to have the blue building, then a green building, and what do you know, a building after that. Point is, all 3 of these buildings in a row were designed by the same architecture firm of Cohn, Pedersen, and Fox from New York. It's like an architectural hat trick on the river. The blue one is the newest of the 3, built in 2003. It's 37 stories tall, and the clear part at the top, that houses their mechanical equipment for their elevators, and they light it up at night. It can change colors. It was green for St. Patrick's Day. It'll be red, white, and blue for the 4th. You get the idea. is 333 West Wacker Drive. This was Cohen, Pedersen, and Fox's first commission in Chicago in 1983. This building made them famous. It is one of the most photographed in the city because it's a perfect example of contextual architecture. That glass curtain wall curves to follow the bend. They use 2 shades of green glass to match the water. It's a giant funhouse mirror. Everything's reflected. And in the bottom corners, there are circled louvered vents. Those circles are reflected along the whole second story and above the front door of the building coming up next door, 225 West Wacker. And then the columns that flank the front doors and hold up the bottom corners, those columns all have 8 sides. If you look across the river at the Merchandise Mart, the top of it, all the towers have 8 sides as well. So they really put a lot of thought into the details of that green building. If you're fans of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, that's where they want you to think that Ferris's dad works. If you watch that movie closely, they flash that building quick when he's on the phone at the office. I know, big whoop. But what I think is cool about watching that movie these days, none of the other buildings were constructed around it yet. So it's kind of a cool perspective what was then and what you see today. So 225 West Wacker next door is the middle child of the 3 from Cohen, Pedersen, and Fox. It's built in 1989. Because of where that building sits and the bends and curves of the river, it's visible from a lot of angles. So they married together different styles. It has a shiny mirrored windows and some of the metal elements of the more modern buildings on the South Branch, but it's also covered in granite to remind you of the stonework of the older buildings on the main branch. No matter which way you see it from, it blends in. I promised I'd explain to you guys how the bridges work, so let's get down to it. I don't like to be a liar. Most of the bridges downtown are the double leaf bascule trunnion style. Double leaf just means that they're split down the middle and that creates 2 separate halves. Bascule is a French word for seesaw, and trunnion refers to a pin. So if you look up ahead at LaSalle, it's split down the middle. The parts that you can't see on either side, stuck inside those walls, that's a giant steel circle in there. In the middle of that giant steel circle is a giant pin or trunnion. They use counterweights the size of Volkswagens. They drop the weights down into pits, and that makes the circle rotate around the pin, and that way you can raise one side of the bridge or the other, or both at the same time, primarily for sailboats at the beginning and end of boating season. If you go to other parts of the world and they have bridges like these, they typically call them Chicago-style bridges, because first of all, that's a lot easier to say than double leaf bascule trunnion, and we have perfected this style. Next on the right then, we are going to have the LaSalle Wacker building. That's what it says across the front. You can't argue with that logic. This was built in 1930 and is a typical office building from that era because in 1922, a city ordinance was put into effect stating any office tower above a certain height had to provide a light well. The middle part of that building that looks like it's missing, that's a light well. It was designed to allow more sunlight to get to street level. In the 20s, when we started building skyscrapers, people got paranoid. They thought we were going to block the sun right out of the sky with all the buildings, and we'd all be walking around in the dark in the daytime. So they instituted the use of light wells. After this next bridge on the right, we're going to have the building with shiny blue-gray mirrored windows and tall white Portuguese granite columns that rise all the way to the top of 50 stories. This is 77 West Wacker, built in 1992 by Ricardo Bofill. It's a good example of a neoclassical building because it has that classic Greek architecture element